I remember vividly finishing the book and closing it, sitting it down on my nightstand, and then kind of rolling over and looking at my wife and saying, "We need to talk."
Welcome to Voices of Deconversion, where atheists and agnostics share their stories of deconversion from Christianity. Now here's Steve with today's guest.
Okay, so today I'm here with Robert Parham. Robert is a former Southern Baptist minister of 13 years. He's been a licensed mental health counselor in private practice for the last 13 years. He's been married to his partner for 16 years, and they have 2 children, ages 10 and 12. They moved to Tampa, Florida 2.5 years ago after living in Tacoma, Washington for 13 years. Robert also enjoys playing golf and tennis on a regular basis. Robert, welcome to the show.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, you bet. So I was going to ask you, I know that, we used to actually sort of be neighbors right down the street pretty much. And I knew you golfed back then, but how long have you been golfing and playing tennis?
Well, I've probably been golfing regularly for the past, 20 years.
Oh, okay. A long time.
But I've been playing tennis since my early 20s.
Oh, okay, cool.
Right after high school, and when I got into college, I started playing for fun and took a class and everything.
That's awesome.
And actually, the whole 13 years that we lived in Washington, I didn't play at all. So I was very happy that when we got here to Florida, that I would be able to pick that up again. Because as you know, unless you are a member of a club that has indoor courts, you're not going to be playing tennis very much in the Pacific Northwest.
I know. That's one of those things. Chrissy and I would pick up a tennis racket, go to a high school or something, hit the ball around, think, this is fun. We should do this more often. Then 2 months later, not going to be doing this very often. Yeah. So you said or you told me that you consider yourself an agnostic atheist. So I was kind of curious about that. So why did you choose to, like a lot of times people say, oh, I'm agnostic or I'm atheist. Why do you describe yourself as an agnostic atheist?
Well, Gnosticism has to do with knowledge and knowing, and theism has to do with belief. So in my opinion, I don't think there's such a thing as just an agnostic or just an atheist. You have to either be a Gnostic atheist or an agnostic atheist, or you're a Gnostic theist or an agnostic theist. So my position is that I don't know for a fact that there isn't some type of supreme being that exists somewhere.
Right.
I just don't see any evidence of one, and so I don't believe in one.
Yeah.
So that's my position.
That's cool. I like that explanation. That's good. So let's start with your Christian origin story. When did you become a Christian, and describe your religious upbringing?
Well, I became a Christian when I was 11 years old. Now, I was brought up in the Southern Baptist tradition, so some of the language that, any of your listeners from a similar tradition would be familiar with would be things like, I got saved.
Yeah.
Or I was born again. That happened when I was 11 years old at a week-long revival at my home church. And I even remember the name of the evangelist. His name is Junior Hill. And he was kind of a big, heavy set man with a loud, blustering voice. And, and this was kind of at the tail end of the 70s, probably 1979, when this happened. And so this was still during the days, even in the Southern Baptist Church, where you would hear a lot of hellfire and brimstone type of sermons, especially during revival week. And it was one of those sermons. Scared the crap out of me as an 11-year-old kid. I don't want to die and go to hell. So I walked the aisle and sat in a back room behind the sanctuary with one of I think it was a deacon in our church actually, and prayed the sinner's prayer, it's called.
Yeah.
And asked Jesus to come into my heart. And from that point forward, I was all in.
Wow. Yeah, that's very familiar language to me. I mean, I'm not obviously from the South, but the born again Christian, I mean, that was my background too, the more of a Pentecostal background, but charismatic, speaking in tongues, all that stuff. But yeah, the saved, born again, the being at camp, when I was a kid, being at camp and then having the preacher make a call, or, you know, at the end of camp, they'd have a big call to like get saved and get
an
right
altar
with God.
call.
Yep.
Yeah, an altar call. I think we always called them invitations.
Well, so how did your faith change as you grew up and grew older?
Well, you know, like I said, I was all in even from the age of 11. And from that point forward, I mean, my parents, we didn't really attend church regularly. We would go to church every once in a while. My grandparents actually were the stronger influence in my life in that sense, because they were there every time the doors were open, basically. And I became much like them. So I was there for Sunday school and service on Sunday mornings. I was there for youth choir on Sunday afternoon and for discipleship training. And then for evening services on Sunday. I was there on Wednesday nights we had prayer meeting on Wednesday nights. They also, in the Southern Baptist Church, they have what they call Royal Ambassadors, for young men, and I participated in that.
Is that like a mentorship program of some sort?
Well, Royal Ambassadors is more. It's supposed to be more of a service oriented kind of activity where you might have Bible study, but the focus is more on what you can do to serve your community. But to be honest, our A program centered around basketball.
Oh, wow.
Because there was RA basketball leagues. And so you played other RA groups from other Southern Baptist churches in the city. And in order to play, you had to attend the Wednesday night RA group.
Oh boy. So
which almost always consisted of simply going out to the church parking lot and practicing basketball.
That's really funny.
There was a pledge and everything.
That's really funny. So it wasn't really about God or the Bible or anything like that. It was more like pretty much a basketball.
It was supposed to be. It was supposed to be. But I think most of the time it really just centered on getting, because we had guys that were like ringers on our team who hardly ever attended anything at the church.
Yeah, they're just there for the sports.
But they came so that they could play basketball.
That's funny. Cool. So you're going through kind of, you said you were all in from age 11, and then you kind of got engaged in this kind of stuff. And then what were you saying when I cut in?
Well, what ended up happening is that as I got older and into my mid to later teenage years, especially once I got into high school, I became more of a kind of a leader or one of those youth and let me say this too, I was a part of a pretty large congregation, not a mega church, but in a small town of 50,000 people, our church ran, somewhere around 400 or 500, sometimes maybe more than that, 600 or 700 a week, in Sunday school.
Wow.
So, the older youth tended to be more the leaders in the youth group. And certainly by the time I was, 16, 17 years old, I kind of was in that role myself, where I would occasionally, maybe lead a Bible study. We always had what we called a youth week at the church, where all of the young people in the church, filled all of the leadership positions. Mm-hmm. And that included the pastor and the minister of music, the minister of education, the minister of youth, the deacons, the ushers, the Sunday school teachers. I mean, we had a very large youth group. So,
wow.
And there was a year that I was the pastor for Youth Week. And there was, a couple of years, I think, that I was the minister of music for Youth Week. And I even, by the time I was a senior in high school, the summer before my senior year, our church started a mission chapel right out on the highway.
Oh. And
it was just, one of these prefab double wide trailers, basically, with a steeple on it. I still have a picture, actually, of me and the pastor standing on the front steps of that thing. But I volunteered to go out and lead the music for this mission church.
And so a mission church would be what? Because I'm not familiar with that phrase.
Well, this was not a part of, because in the Southern Baptist Church, you have this mission board that handles both home missions and church planting in underserved areas, as well as foreign missions. This was a very specific outreach of our church. So our church purchased this building. We had a retired missionary who was a member of our church. He volunteered to pastor this little chapel, and I went and offered to do music there. Okay. And so they set it up actually in a mobile home park out on the highway where there were several mobile home parks. So it was really kind of targeting that community, a lower income, community out on the highway where it was all these mobile home parks. But I got to, I'll brag about myself a little bit though. I had always been the kind of person who didn't do anything halfway. This little chapel that only ran maybe 20 people a week in service had some of the best music of any church in town. Because I had a lot of friends, and those friends tended to be talented singers and musicians. So we always, had special music, guest singers coming in from my church and other churches, friends from school. I even brought, we did a Christmas program in high school, and I kind of handpicked and asked a group of students in our concert choir who I knew were Christian, kids and everything, if they would be willing to come to the chapel and do our high school Christmas concert program for this little chapel. And they did. So, it was about 10 or 12 of us that came, had enough to have each part represented. We put on a little concert for this little chapel, So that's kind of how it started. I just, and I kind of knew at that time that I knew that God wanted me to be a minister. I just wasn't sure what kind of minister yet.
So how did that process unfold? How did you determine, and I'm sure at the time, how you would have said, how did God help, determine for you or something? But how did you determine what kind of minister you wanted to be?
And it's hard to talk about that now, because it gets filtered somewhat through the way I think now and what I believe now, what I know now, what I've learned over the years. But trying to put myself in the frame of mind I was in at the time, the only thing I can say is I truly felt like God was somehow making me feel like this is what he wanted me to do. Mm-hmm. I didn't hear an audible voice. I mean, I didn't hear some voice say, you should be a minister, But all of these opportunities seemed to come along that were kind of guiding me in that direction. That's how it felt. And so I didn't have any doubt about it. My only question was exactly what it was that God want me to do.
Yeah.
Now in hindsight, looking back at it, I think of it almost like anything else. Your mind, which is governed, by your brain itself, has its own system of biases based on what your beliefs are. And, it's also like anything else in terms of experiences. We all seem to have this automatic way of attributing our experiences to whatever our foundation of life is.
Yeah.
And the way we live, so if you're a very devout Christian, then all of your experiences in life, you're going to filter through this belief that God has a plan for you and that, nothing happens that's outside of his plan, that kind of a belief. So certainly that's where I was coming from at the time. So that was really what led me to go into the ministry.
Okay. Yeah. Did you go to some kind of formal training or to become a minister?
I did. The first thing is I became licensed. Now, in the Southern Baptist Church, you have two different statuses. You have a license to minister the gospel, and then you get ordained. Okay. And so a license basically is your local church gives you a license, and I still have it actually in a frame. It's actually on the floor behind me here, but that is your church, your pastor, and your church basically giving you a vote of confidence that they agree, that they've prayed about it, and they agree based on what they've observed in your behavior and the way you conduct yourself, that God has indeed called you into the ministry. But ordination is a very much, it's a much more formal process that involves interviewing and more demonstrated leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And that almost always doesn't even happen at your home church. It usually doesn't happen until after you go to the seminary. And it might be done at whatever church you are currently serving is where you would get ordained. I never reached that point. But my training was, I went to Samford University, not Stanford in California, but Samford, S-A-M-F-O-R-D. Samford is a Southern Baptist University in Birmingham, Alabama. And I had a lot of scholarship money because I was a ministerial student. So even though it was a private school and very expensive, for ministerial students, it's actually quite reasonable. And so that's where I went to school. And I ended up, focusing on music. So my bachelor's degree is in church music.
Yeah, church is church, it seems like, just is such a great place for people who are musicians or musically inclined or just enjoy that part of life, I think for my son, Ryan is my oldest, he loves choir. I was never into that, but he is so into it, and it's his social group, it's all his best friends, and he's doing extracurricular stuff after school, and it's always choir stuff. So I think that's one thing that church has probably brought a lot of good into people's lives,
Oh yeah. And that was it for me. I loved to sing. I was in concert choir and men's chorus in high school, sang in the choir at church. And then I didn't mention this, but before I went to Samford, I started at a community college, and I had a full ride scholarship there because I was singing in their PR group, their public relations group. So I went there to get all of my prerequisites out of the way and a few music courses. And then I transferred to Samford, where I sang in the university chorale there and played in the handbell choir.
Cool. So that's kind of your experience and how you got into the church. Then when was your first, what was your first opportunity to become a minister? Because obviously you served for 13 years, so that's quite a long time.
I served as, voluntarily, it wasn't a paid position in that mission church, for, the summer before all of my senior year and the summer after my senior year. And then after I moved to Birmingham and got settled in school, then I began looking for a part-time church, position where I could do something. And I ended up, being a part-time youth pastor at a small church, south of Birmingham in a little community called Alabaster. And I was there for a while, and then I moved to a different church and served there for a while, a year or two, and then I left there and went to another church and served there for a little while. So it was mostly part-time all through college. And then after I finished my degree in 1992, it was a 5-year program, by the way, the church music program is. I then took an interim position at a large church up in Arab, Alabama, and ended up being their interim for a year because right after I got there, their pastor resigned.
Oh. So
all of their efforts to find a full-time minister of music stopped because their priority now became finding a pastor, because they, of course, most churches would want their pastor to be involved in who the other staff are going to be that they hire. So I went from there. I had a church come and visit me, and I ended up going and being invited and accepting a full-time minister of music and youth position at a church in Brent, Alabama. Brent Baptist Church. And I was there briefly. There was a huge scandal right after I got there with the pastor of that church. and I ended up not making it, not lasting very long there. I think I was only there for maybe, maybe 6 months that I was there, and I kind of abruptly had to find something else. So I moved back to Birmingham and took another part-time church position as minister of music, and then went back to grad school.
Okay. So you were kind of part-time. I mean, obviously you have some experience with the Baptist church.
Oh yeah.
So you understand that culture really well, you know?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And even after grad school, when I moved to Memphis to take a full-time position as a therapist, case manager, I had a part-time church job on the side. So I've been except for that 6-month period at that full-time position, I was always a bivocational minister, working part of full-time in a secular career or job, and then having a church part-time and going to school full-time.
Yeah. So the grad school was the mental health counselor.
Yes.
Okay. That was that path.
Yeah. And interestingly, and this is important to my story actually, is that it was that experience with the church where there was a scandal with the pastor that led me to change my mind about going to seminary, because I ended up doing a lot of counseling with young people and their parents at that time because of all this stuff going on with the pastor, and felt so inadequate in what I was doing. And I thought, if I'm going to stay in the ministry, I probably should get some skills. And so that's why I thought, well, you know what? I think what I'll do is I'll go to grad school and get a degree in counseling, and I'll use that degree to enhance my ministry. Well, boy, did I.
Well, it's almost like that it's like in the back of your mind somewhere, it's like maybe you knew that you needed to kind of get a degree, in something other than ministry. It's almost like you knew based on this experience. Maybe, yeah. Maybe.
I mean, maybe, but I don't know that at the time it was very conscious. My memory of that time, and it's been quite a while now, but my memory of that time is I honestly, sincerely did it simply because I thought it was something that I needed in order to be more effective in my ministry.
Yeah.
But it's what changed my life.
So, yeah.
Going to grad school.
That's amazing. So it was this scandal at this church that basically started you thinking that maybe you needed to kind of get into something else to help your ministry, but it was the thing that got you going down that path.
Different direction, yes.
Okay, so that leads right into kind of the next phase of questions, which are all about questions and doubts. So can you identify a time, and maybe that was it, or maybe it was down the road from that, but a time when you began to doubt some of your beliefs or question some of the things that you'd believed?
Well, I think my experience with doubts is probably no different than most Christians. I actually think most Christians go through periods of doubt all throughout their life, where they're like, why God, why? And, do you even exist kind of thoughts. And, but they quickly, and I did this as well, they quickly dismiss any of those doubts because the thought of continuing a path of investigation into why you're doubting is too scary.
Oh yeah.
And so you're basically scared back into just saying, no, this is just all about my lack of faith. And it's about me not being as close to God as I should be. We turn it back on ourselves. The reasons for the doubts have nothing to do with any legitimate reason to doubt. The reason you're doubting is because of your lack of faith and your lack of, diligence and your study and, prayer. And, it's all about you and your relationship with God. So it really wasn't until grad school that I really had a serious series of events that led me to stick with the doubts and to honestly look at my doubts. And the catalyst for that was that I had a course in multicultural counseling of course, where the emphasis is on diversity. And we had this huge project that we had to do for this class that had 3 parts to it that involved picking a group, an oppressed group or a targeted group that you think you will have the hardest time working with. And one of the groups that were listed, they had people like indigenous people, like Native Americans. They had people with disabilities, people of color, all these various groups. And one of them was people who were gay and lesbian. And being a very conservative Southern Baptist all my life, we, of course, and I, of course, believed that homosexuality was an abomination, and that you cannot be homosexual and be saved and be a Christian. My belief is that if you're gay, then you're basically doomed to die and go to hell. So I thought, well, that's the one that's going to be a challenge for me.
That's the toughest.
Yeah. And so I thought, okay, if I'm going to be, really honest with myself, then I have to pick this one. So I did. And that's where it all started. To tell you all about that project would take another hour. So I won't do that. But what I'll do is I'll tell you in summary that this process led me to seriously question whether or not what I believe the Bible said and what God meant about homosexuality was true. Hmm. And at the end of it, I came to the decision that it couldn't be, that it's not possible for that to be true unless I have to also admit that God is a sick bastard. Okay. And in that case, I wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. Okay. And so that was the point at which I didn't give up my belief. I became this moderate kind of a Christian who kind of joined other Christians who did not adopt this position of biblical infallibility and inerrancy.
Yeah.
Right? Because as a conservative Christian, I believe the Bible was infallible and inerrant. It was the Word of God. And almost everything in it should be interpreted literally. And so that's how it started. I started with a change to being more liberally minded when it came to the Bible and scriptures.
So was it that God was a sick bastard because he created people who he created gay and then they couldn't help it? Is that what it was? Exactly.
So because the conclusion that I came to is that being gay is no more a choice than my being straight. Okay. There is no difference. Okay. Some of the experiences I had in this project that I had to do for class just were so emotionally moving to me. And I don't know, compassion, the compassion that I felt for the people that I came in contact with, and their stories, really, really enlightened me and educated me.
Wow.
So that's how it started. But what happened was then I began to read more moderate and more liberal, books in Christianity. And it started with John Shelby Spong.
Ah.
Yeah. And, and so that even challenged me even more, because here's a supposedly Christian, Episcopal bishop, writing all of these things about Christianity and the Bible that to me were just blasphemous, but over time, and Spong is not just some commentary person or theologian, he's a very scholarly, person.
Yeah.
So, what he writes is based on scholarly work. And that was the first time I had read anything of a scholarly nature that was anything but conforming to my own conservative views on the Bible. So that took me down the path of being a more progressive and liberal Christian, than I ever dreamed that I would be. But I could not give up a belief in God at that time.
So you hung on to that belief in God. Was there something in particular in either Shelby Spong's book or in another person's book that you read that you really remember challenging you at that time?
Well, from Spong's book, it's providing different perspectives and interpretations of those scriptures in the Bible. And there aren't many. There's only about 6 verses in the Bible, and that say anything related to homosexuality. And 2 of those are even questionable in terms of being about homosexuality. So that brings you down to 4 verses in the entire Bible. And he gives you a very different way of looking at those that places the scripture in the context that they were written. And that's another problem with conservative Christianity, is everything in the Bible applies to today, And today, of course, I look back and I go, how can people think that? It blows my mind that I once thought that way. Context is extremely important, but for some reason, conservative Christians don't think so. So that was it. He provided more context in terms of, and he emphasized how important context is to how you interpret scripture. So that was the most important thing to me, I think, in my transition. It's what led me to believe that most of the Old Testament's nothing but what, Jewish, scholars refer to as Midrash, which is a form of storytelling, much like New Testament parables. So it's what led me to believe that, for example, the story of Moses and the parting of the Red Sea and Jonah and the whale, all of these Old Testament stories are not real historical events. They're stories that were told to make a point.
Yeah. Oral traditions passed down.
Yeah, oral traditions, exactly. So that's really where it all kind of started, but it just never stopped really, until a certain point, and that was after I got married.
Oh, okay. So yeah, tell me about that, because that's kind of where I was going next, was just to ask you, kind of at the same time, I want to find out, like, when did you realize it's over? I don't believe in God, or I don't know that I can know if there's a God.
Yeah.
When did that moment happen? And then was there anything keeping you hanging on to the faith?
Well, I can answer that last question first, because that's an easy one. What kept me hanging on was the fear of it not being true. And what does that mean? When your entire life, at least the way you think about it, when your entire life is based on your belief in God and the promise of salvation, and what comes with that is that, without that salvation, that you're doomed. Then it's not something that's easy to just let go of and give up. Because then you're left with, okay, now what? If this isn't what my life is based on, if this isn't what gives me purpose, then what does? So that's what kept me hanging on. But what happened was I met my wife while I was in Memphis, and I was serving at church part-time at that time, and then moved to Charleston to take a new position. And it was once I got to Charleston that I just I never looked for a church. Well, I did briefly. In the very beginning, when I first got there, I looked. But what happened is in the initial interview, it became very clear to me that it was going to be a terrible fit, because this was a very conservative congregation.
And by that time...
Oh, yeah. And
you were more liberal in your...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the church that I was serving in Memphis, I kept my mouth shut a lot, because if I say what I think, they're going to kick me out of here.
Oh, man. It's just like, I know what that feels like, being in church and hearing things said, and you're just like, oh my goodness, I am so not here. Like, I'm so not where they're at.
Oh, absolutely. And that was me. So I was already basically hanging on to the church music work just because of my love of music, for my love of choral music, for my love of sacred music, and the beauty of it all. So once I got to Memphis and talked to this one pastor at this church that was looking for someone, after I had that conversation, I just kind of thought, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to do this again. At least not in the Southern Baptist Church. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are very liberal Southern Baptist churches. A lot of people don't know that. But they're hard to find. There aren't very many. And there probably are more of them today than, back then, but at the time there just weren't very many. And so I just didn't look. I just didn't look anymore. And my wife and I, and the other thing was, what happened was my wife, we weren't married yet, and due to circumstances of her trying to get to Charleston so that we would live near each other, ended up having to move in with me. So
check that box. That's another thing that the Southern Baptist Church wouldn't like.
So I'm like, oh well, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, they're never going to let me in through the doors.
Right, because now I'm living in sin. So that put a stop to that. And then we ended up getting married, and she actually she was raised Catholic, which is another thing. I would have never I wouldn't probably not even dated a Catholic back when I was a conservative Christian. But by this point, of course, it wasn't that important to me. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up going to an Episcopal church. So it that's kind of in between in a way. Exactly. Episcopalian is as close as you can get to being Catholic without being Catholic, because they have almost all the same liturgy and, traditions. They're just not Catholic. Yeah. And a lot of them, and it really suited me well, because most Southern Baptist churches were getting into more contemporary type of music and services. And I was more of a traditionalist. And in the Episcopal church we attended, I just loved the music. They had a choir. The organ was the dominant instrument still. So I loved it.
That's cool.
So we attended there while we were in Charleston. And then we got married. We moved to Washington not long after that. And we visited several churches over, about a year or two. And then we got pregnant. And that's when things started to change for me in terms of, do I really want my child to be raised in the church? I don't know. And I think I was also in denial, really, about exactly where I was in my belief, and I didn't want to think about it. So I just never brought it up. I never talked about it. I never brought up going to church, and thankfully, my wife didn't either. So really, starting in Charleston, it took about 10 years of not really being active in the church, not really attending church, and just kind of ignoring faith on my part anyway, until 2008. And 2008 is significant because that's when a lot of the books started coming out by Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, Victor Stenger. These guys started producing all of these books. And I cannot tell you what made me pick it up. But I was in the bookstore one day and I thought, I'm going to read it. So I bought Richard Dawkins' book.
The God Delusion.
Yeah, The God Delusion. And read that and found it just immensely fascinating. And that's what started me on this just vociferous pursuit. I was reading everything I could get my hands on. So I was reading all of those guys. I mean, I've got a couple of bookshelves here behind me that's nothing but those types of books, because I had never allowed myself to read anything like that. And it was reading Sam Harris's book, The End of Faith. I was reading that one after reading a bunch of others, and I was laying in bed next to my wife when I finished the book. And I remember vividly finishing the book and closing it, setting it down on my nightstand, and then kind of rolling over and looking at my wife and saying, "We need to talk."
That's an amazing story. And before you tell me what her response was, because that's really interesting. That's going to be really interesting. Did any family members know what you guys were thinking or going through?
No.
Okay. No clue.
No clue. I think this is where I was really lucky. We lived all the way across the country. All of my family are still in North Alabama, and we lived out in Washington State. So I had this, nearly 3,000 mile buffer. It just, and it never came up. Most of my family would have probably never even questioned whether or not I was going to church.
Well, why would they? You were a Baptist minister. They would never question it.
Oh yeah, they wouldn't. And I'll be honest with you. Even in the beginning, there were a few times where I got asked to pray, and I did. I did, and it was because I didn't want to tell them. I didn't want to tell anybody. I didn't want to make a scene or make an issue out of it. So I'd be asked to pray, and all right, so I'd pray. I remember also we lived right across the street from this Methodist church in Tacoma, and the pastor and his wife lived right next door to us, and we became pretty good friends with them. And in fact, she babysat our son when he was a baby several times, and they had moved on. And then after I, had gotten to the point where I was, we had gone to visit them on the way somewhere else. And while we were at their house, they asked me to pray because we had dinner with them. And so here's this Methodist pastor and his wife that we know, and we're having dinner, and, Robert, would you mind saying the blessing for us? I'm like, well, okay, sure. and I'll be honest with you. I think it was because I was so afraid of sounding fake. I probably prayed the most eloquent, beautiful prayers of my entire life in that short amount of time where I no longer believed in God, but wasn't ready to tell everybody.
Yeah.
Because I just felt a lot of pressure, to make it believable.
Yeah. You don't want anyone. I mean, I dreaded the idea that someone would ask, like, are you still a Christian? I mean, no one would ever ask it, but I was like terrified someone would ask.
Yeah.
In a moment like that, like, it's like,
Yeah.
But so anyway, so you finish The End of Faith, you close the book, you put it on the nightstand, and you turn over and you tell your wife, we need to talk. What happened? What happened next?
It was emotional, even though she grew up Catholic and we hadn't really been going to church, for years. Like most Catholics, she was kind of after she left home and went to college, she rarely ever went to Mass. And she didn't really know a lot about the Bible or her faith. She was just raised a Catholic,
Yeah.
But it was important to her. And she definitely believed in God and still prayed, although I didn't see her pray. I never saw her pray, but she told me that she did. And she cried. She teared up and everything, but I'll tell you, I felt very confident when I told her. I wasn't scared to tell her. And it was because I knew we had already spent the last probably 6 years of never going to church, and me not ever talking about it, and just living our lives and raising our 2 kids. I'm like, nothing's going to happen. This isn't going to change anything, really.
That's amazing.
So I had confidence, about that, but I was still worried about how it might hurt her emotionally. So when I told her, it was tough for her. But it's all right. And over time, and I know you've met my wife, when we invited you, over to the house for dinner, but
yeah,
she slowly began to drift more towards where I was. Now, to this day, I couldn't tell you that she's a non-believer like I am, but she certainly is not a practicing Christian at all. She's probably kind of where I was, during those years where I was in denial. But it's just a non-issue in our lives. We don't raise our kids in the church. That's never been an issue for us. She's in agreement with that. So it's worked out. But the initial kind of shock of it all, because when we met, I was a minister. I was working in a church when we met. And so that part of who I was when she met me is not a part of who I am anymore.
But that's really cool, though, that like you knew deep down this isn't going to change anything. Like you had a strong enough relationship, and you'd gone years without really bringing up church or God for the most part. And it's so funny that the most important things in life really don't need God in them. Exactly.
That's exactly it.
There's so much common ground between the liberal Christian and the agnostic or atheist, in my view.
Yeah.
And, they both kind of feel like, do what you need to do to make your life more full or better, but you can have great relationships. You don't need to go to church each Sunday to be a good person or to have a great marriage or any of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And in fact, I've seen a multitude of examples of how faith and church attendance and devoutness has absolutely no positive influence on whether or not you're going to have a good marriage. I mean,
right.
The divorce rates are just as high in the church as they are anywhere else. So.
Right. And I know that bugged my church going through when I was growing up. It was talked about. And I think that really bothered Christians, that like the church was no better,
Right.
But that's the thing. They're no better.
Yeah. I know, and that's been kind of what I talk about to some of my Christian friends over the years is, what good does being a Christian do you in this life? Because all you really have, in my opinion, all you have that Christianity gives you that I don't already have has nothing to do with this life. It has to do with what you think is going to happen when you die. Okay, that's it. And that doesn't bother me because I don't think there is anything anyway. So there, I don't need it,
Yeah. So what, I guess, during this time, did you or your wife talk to any family? I mean, I know that you, to some extent, kind of came out to your family and told them what you believed. How did that go?
That took a couple of more years. Took a couple of more years because that I knew was going to be tough. And I knew that the person it was going to hurt the most was my mother. And I'll be honest too, if my grandparents, my mother's parents were still living, I would not have said anything because it would have killed them. It would have caused them too much pain, and I couldn't live with that. So I'm actually very thankful that both of my grandparents were already deceased. But I remember my mother came to visit us in Washington, and it was probably 2010, maybe 2011. And so at least 2 years, maybe even 3 after I, told my wife I don't believe anymore. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to tell her at the beginning of her visit and ruin the entire visit.
Right.
But I also didn't want to wait until the last minute and tell her, oh, by the way, I don't believe in God. Bye.
Have a nice trip home.
Right. So I waited until about halfway through her visit and sat down at the kitchen table with her and my wife and told her as gently as I possibly could I knew it didn't matter how gentle I was about how I told her. And she, of course, cried, there at the table, and it was hard for her. And I completely understand why it would be very hard for her. It wasn't as hard for my dad. I remember my conversation with my dad. It's funny because growing up, he never went to church. But then after I left and he met his new wife, he started going to church all the time. It was kind of interesting to me.
That's funny.
Because she was a very conservative Christian churchgoer, Southern Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
But when I called and told him over the phone, he says, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yes, Dad, I'm sure." "Well, but are you sure?" "Yes, I'm positive." "Well, yeah, but are you sure that you're sure?" I mean, this is like 3 or 4 attempts on his part, asking me, "Are you positive? Are you sure that, this is what you think?" And, he's like, "Well, I don't know what to say," but I'll tell you this too. Before my mother came out to visit, I knew that I was going to tell her. This is so mean of me, to do this to my brother, but my brother, who's 10 years younger than me, lives very close to my mother and sees her all the time. So I called him and gave him a heads up of what I was about to do.
I think that's nice. That doesn't seem like a bad thing.
Oh no, he was like, "Thanks a lot." You're going to tell her this, and then I have to pick up the pieces.
Oh. You're like, "So I'm about to drop a bomb, just letting you know, and you're going to have to do the cleanup here."
Right. I said, so that was, I don't know, it was tough. And my brother's, he believes in God, but he's never really gone to church either. Growing up, if you tried to have some kind of a conversation based on the Bible or theology, he would be completely lost because he really doesn't know much about the Bible or Christianity really, but he believes, he's just, he grew up in North Alabama. Everybody there is practically everybody's a Christian and goes to church, and, and even if you don't, you still believe. And
yeah,
it's just the culture of the South,
I think obviously it's true of the South, but I think for a lot of Christians, it's a very kind of a nominal thing. They might go to church every Sunday, but they don't think too much about it. It's just something they've been raised with.
It's just part of what you do.
Yeah.
And especially in smaller towns, the church, it's kind of like in the South and in all high school football is like the thing that brings the town together every Friday night. Well, mm-hmm. Church is the same way in the South. It's just a part of what the community's built on, is the activities and everything going on at the church.
Yeah. Did you miss a lot of that once you became a non-believer? Did you miss the community or?
I thought I would miss it more than I actually did. I miss the music. I miss some of the, I miss the food. Southern Baptists can cook, let me tell you. So I miss all of the potlucks, I miss that and everything. But what I don't miss is what comes with it. And to be honest, it's allowed me to have more time with my family, more quality time, just me with my family. It's allowed me to have more time just for myself. It's allowed me to play more tennis and more golf. And quite frankly, I think since I've given up my belief and going to church and everything, it's actually enhanced my life far beyond anything it ever was when I was a conservative Christian minister.
That's really cool. That's a hopeful message, because I think for a lot of people, especially in the throes of losing their faith, it can look really dark and gloomy down at the, out at the horizon. But to know, like, someone like yourself, it enhanced your life. It made your life more full. You were able to spend more time with family and explore hobbies and activities that you really loved.
Well, and it also gave me an opportunity to study something that I had never really been interested in growing up, and that was science. Science was not one of my strong suits. I think all I had to have to graduate high school was one science, biology, and I made a D in that. I just was not a very strong science student. Never took physics, never took chemistry. But here I am, a grown adult with a family, for the first time really having an interest in science, an interest in cosmology and, in astronomy and biology, in particular evolutionary biology. But I'm fascinated by science now.
That's cool.
And that's something that's interesting. I'm not sure why that is. Why is it that all of a sudden I have this love for it that was non-existent back when I was young? And my only explanation, and I don't have any kind of facts or data to back this up, but I wonder if my lack of interest in science was because I didn't feel like I needed it. The Bible had all the answers. Why do I need science?
Yeah. You're the church kind of tells you, don't look over there. You don't need to.
Right. Well, and certainly about anything that's contradictory to the Bible, like evolution, for example.
Right.
And homosexuality.
I love that though. It just opens up a whole new world to you, and it's like now you can shop. Now you can shop around. Well, bookstores are kind of hard to find these days, but now you can go to that part of the bookstore.
Yeah.
Go to the science section
absolutely.
and start browsing through that stuff. That's pretty cool.
Right. And now I'm one of those people who wishes that they would move the religion section in with the mythology section.
They're so similar. Hello.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of all the same.
Yeah.
So, when you think back on the Christian you, the Baptist minister, Robert, what do you think of that person now?
Well, I definitely think that I was a good, a quote, good person. I mean, everything I did, even when I would talk about things that, today I'm embarrassed about, they were all done with good intentions. I mean, I truly was a believer, wholeheartedly. And I mean, that's one of the things that people ask now, because, people say, well, you never were a Christian to begin with. I'm like, listen, I'll say what Dan Barker says all the time. Dan Barker of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. If I wasn't a Christian, then nobody was. Okay. But, that person was compassionate. I'll tell you, I don't think there's a whole lot of difference between who I am as a human being from a very basic fundamental level. Okay. I'm still who I am. But what I don't have is all of the negative aspects of what religion gave me. Okay. So the homophobia, the racism, the sexism, misogyny, patriarchy, and even though the Bible and religion isn't really doing this in the South, it's almost one and the same, that it also dictates your politics. And so that's another thing that changed for me, is that I went from being, a Republican, to being a Democrat. So, and I'm, this is how progressive and liberal I am. I'm all for Bernie Sanders,
Yeah.
But, the things that I would think of now as being negative things, I certainly regret. And there's even been at least one person that I contacted who, in high school, I knew he was gay. And there was an incident between us where I think I made him feel judged. And I've since made amends with him and apologized to him for my behavior.
Wow. Back
then.
That's cool.
Well, and I've known ministers actually who are married and have kids and they're gay. They've confided in me with that information. And I've tried to encourage them, even through their major depression and suicide attempts, that they don't have to hold on to these very rigid, conservative, literal interpretations of the Bible in order to be a Christian. But they just can't let it go. They truly think that there's something fundamentally flawed about them as human beings, and that only through God's grace are they going to be made whole. But then they inevitably discover that God's not answering their prayer and taking the gate away from them. So they live in torment. And it causes all kinds of physical illness, mental illness, and even suicide. It's very tragic. It's one of the things that I hate the most about conservative Christianity, is what it does to young people and even adults who are gay. So
it traps them.
It does. They're stuck, and unless they can somehow, make an alteration to the way that they address this issue and their faith and reconcile it, so that they don't feel like there's anything wrong with them. And that's all I can do. Is I don't try to rob them or talk them out of their belief. I try to steer them in a more liberal direction.
Yeah. Well, it's safer.
Yeah.
It helps them hang on to their faith, but to know that you're still within the scope of faith. You don't need to be so rigid. And in fact, right, that rigidness is that fundamentalism that is so dangerous in any faith.
Yeah. I remember coming in contact with a few people in Birmingham even. There was a church down in Southside Birmingham called Southside Baptist Church, where I was flabbergasted at the time to discover that they had an openly gay deacon. Okay. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. This is a Southern Baptist church? And he's a deacon, and he's gay, and he's open, and his partner's in the church.
And nobody cares?
And nobody cares, right? And I would invite people and say, look, there is a place for you. Go visit this church. They will embrace you and accept you for who you are, and there's no judgment at all. You can go there and you can keep your Christianity intact and be you and be accepted there.
That's cool.
And I've tried to do that whenever the opportunity arises. Any place I go, including here in Tampa, I know where there's a church in St. Pete, that is basically known as the gay church because they embrace the gay community. There are several churches in the Tacoma area and obviously in the Seattle area that are like that. Mm-hmm. But that is one of the things that just, I get angry about that issue when it comes to Christianity, and politics, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because it really hurts people.
It does. It's very hurtful, very harmful.
Yeah. So you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but what's the biggest misunderstanding that you'd say Christians have about you now that you're an atheist, agnostic atheist?
Well, one of the things that I hear a lot is that they think that all people who were Christians and then became non-Christians, there must have been something that happened. What is it that made you mad at God? They assume that it had to be something tragic that happened to turn you away. Yeah. And it really wasn't. It was a very long process for me. And it was really more, reading than anything that eventually led me away. And that includes reading the Bible, just reading it through a different lens. And then the other thing is this idea that we've already talked about really, is they really don't understand, I think, how a person has a moral compass without God. And that's a big challenging conversation, because it's hard to communicate in a brief amount of time to people how our values, our morals are socially constructed. And then, trying to tell them that the Bible's not the authority, right? What it is that there were human beings who wrote these books that have been pieced together to make the Bible. And within that are the values of the culture of those people who wrote them. It's not God, some supreme being saying, write this. These are supposed to be your morals. That's the way people interpret it, but that's not how it happened. So to me, that's the biggest thing, is this idea that, you can't possibly have, a moral compass, the idea that something terrible must have happened to you to make you angry with God. Probably those are the two biggest ones, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of dismissive of your experience in a way, like when they say things like that. It's like, no, I read a book. I read several books. I got educated, and, I'm not mad. Just, mad about certain things, maybe homosexuality and things like that, or things like that. But yeah.
Well, and I think that a lot of people who go through this type of transition basically go through Kubler-Ross's stages of grief.
Mm-hmm.
There's this initial shock. There's also denial. I certainly went through that. And there's anger too. I was angry about it as well for a while, because I felt like I'd been hoodwinked. There was this period of time where I felt like, I have wasted so much of my life believing this nonsense, and but then I have to come back and remind myself that there are a lot of really good experiences that I've had in my life that I wouldn't have had without that. Now, I probably would have had other good experiences, but none of us can, it's why I kind of hate the question sometimes, when we ask this question, if you could go back in time and you could change something, what would you change? Well, this is one of those things, I would like to say that I wish I could go back in time and not ever believe in God. But then it would completely change the course of my life.
Yeah.
And I certainly wouldn't want to go back and do that and still have my memory of everything that I've been through now. So if I did that, I would have to have no memory of anything, right? Because the thought of having to go back and then, well, how do I work it that I meet my wife?
Yeah, well, it was such a big formative part of your life. It's not like saying, you chose a blue car. If you could go back, would you choose a red car? It's not like that simple. It's like, no, a huge part of my life was impacted by this in good and bad ways. It's not like and you know what? That's the great thing about life. It's complex. It's just the way life is. And sometimes it's like,
well, and another thing that I struggle with is like, do I regret all of those people that I led to Christ? Do I regret that? Do I regret that I shared the gospel and prayed with all those different, and most of them young people, most of them teenagers? Do I regret doing that, and nurturing, the faith for them? That's a hard one too.
Yeah, I think, like, when I hear you say that, I think of, like, you at that time were someone that cared about that kid or cared about that person.
Oh, absolutely.
And I mean, all you were doing was what you thought was the right thing. And sure, you could regret maybe if that person goes on and makes, poor life decisions because of their faith or something. But
sure,
I mean, at the end of the day, like, you were trying to treat them well. You were trying to do good to them. So that's how I see that. But
yeah, and that's part of how I've kind of looked at it as well, is because you're right, you never know what path their lives may have taken. Maybe, and I have to concede that belief has saved some people from themselves. Maybe there are some of those young people that would have gone down a much darker path if it wasn't for my getting involved in their life.
Mm-hmm.
Bringing them into the church and sharing the gospel with them, and them kind of turning things around in their life.
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of come to the conclusion it's just a complete waste of energy to try to dwell on the past.
Yep.
And do all these what ifs, because it's not, you can't do it. So why waste so much energy?
Why waste time doing it? Well, that's so that brings me to another question here. So now that you've gone through all this, what's the best thing about not believing in God?
Almost everything, I guess. I love having my Sundays to myself and my family, you know. Tomorrow morning, instead of getting up and going to church, me and my wife are going to go play tennis at a sweetheart tennis social.
That's cool.
I'll tell you too, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier, is that one of the things that really changed for me is I used to have these mild panic attacks. And I've had them, you know, all my life growing up, where I would have these moments, usually when I'm alone, and all of a sudden I would just have this very vivid kind of thought process going on about death, you know, where I was scared of what it was going to be like to die. Even though I felt very, very confident in my salvation, to think about dying and then making that transition, we don't really know what that's going to be like. We really don't, you know?
Yeah.
And to me, it was very scary. And I would have these my heart would start pounding in my chest, and I would just get overwhelming, kind of fear. And I would have to just shake it off and, you know, try to make myself not think about it, and, you know, calm myself down. I haven't had one incident of that since I gave up my belief.
Wow.
And I think, so I have to believe that it's a direct result of me no longer even believing that there is anything after you die, you know? So what do you have to freak out about? You know, I know, you know, what was it like before you were born? Well, I don't know. Okay, well, that's what it's going to be like when you die. It's just like that. Nothing.
Yeah, I think that's like a Mark Twain quote or something, isn't it? Like, I didn't worry about it before I was here, and I'm not going to worry about it then, you know? I was fine before, and I'll be fine when I'm gone, you know?
Yeah, so that's another thing that's really changed, you know, that I'm happy about, because I didn't like those experiences, and I haven't had one since 2008.
That's amazing. What I think about is it's almost like when you were having those attacks, it's like your body knew something that your mind wasn't letting you think about, you know, like something was bothering you, and like you were responding physically to it, but you couldn't put your finger on it, you know?
Well, I don't know. I mean, because I knew it was about dying. I mean, I did know that. It was about dying and what that was going to feel like, you know, and what it was going to be like. You know, it was the thought of that, when I really sat down and gave it serious thought, scared me. And I would never tell anybody that. You know, when I would talk about dying and going to heaven, it was always, you know, how wonderful it was going to be, you know. Now today, the thought of eternity, okay, forever and ever and ever, doing nothing but worshiping and praising God, there's not one thing appealing about that. Nothing. No, thank you. No, I don't want to do that.
Quite boring. And for a guy who loves music, that's saying something.
Oh, yeah.
Well, what brings you the most happiness in life now?
Well, it's everything that I now look at in terms of that question about purpose in life. You know, before, my purpose in life was to serve God. Okay. Well, now it's to be the best father, the best husband, the best friend, the best therapist that I can be. You know, and I'm not always perfect at that. You know, I'm probably never perfect at it. Sometimes I'm not the father that I want to be. Sometimes I'm not the husband that I want to be. Sometimes I'm not the friend that I want to be. But that's what I strive for. That's my purpose. That's my goal in life, is to try to become better and better and better at all of those things. You know, that's it. That's what keeps me going. And
that's cool.
And there's no greater joy, and I think Christians would probably say this after they say God, but there's no greater joy for me in life than watching my kids grow up. They're frustrating as hell a lot of times. There's days you want to strangle them, and there's days the thought of their leaving the home one day brings you to tears. My family, my kids and my wife, they're the most important things in my life. They're what give me the most joy and happiness in life. So
that's cool.
So yeah, most Christians would probably say the same thing.
Yeah. Take God off. Like you said, they'd say God, but if you take that away, they're in agreement with you. They're human.
Yeah.
They'd say family, people, relationships.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's cool. So I started this podcast for the former Christian who's lost their faith. What encouragement or piece of guidance would you give that person who's kind of going through what you were going through maybe, many years ago?
Well, the biggest thing is that you're not alone. And, especially since that 2008 period, resources, and with social media, it is, you almost can't feel alone, because there's so much out there in terms of being able to connect with other people who have had similar experiences. I definitely recommend, someone who has given up their faith or their belief in God to look into Recovering from Religion. Recovering from Religion is a nonprofit organization. They have a website, they have a Facebook page, they have, and they have resources, including what's called the Therapist Project. This is a database of therapists around the country who consider themselves to be secular. So if you're worried about going to a counselor, that they're going to be like some Christian counselor who's going to try to use faith in their work with you, well, you can contact the Therapist Project to get a referral. And then more particular for clergy, I would definitely recommend the Clergy Project. The Clergy Project is a nonprofit organization they're very much like Recovering from Religion, only they're specifically for people who have worked in the church, ministers and missionaries, and even academics like seminary professors, clergy who have given up their belief in God. Up until just this past month, I was on the board of directors for the Clergy Project.
I was going to say, I thought you were involved with that. So it sounds like even up until, that's many years.
Yeah, I was actually one of the first members of the Clergy Project, and I, along with several others, were board members at the very beginning. In fact, I am the one who incorporated us. We incorporated here in Florida, and then with the IRS, I handled all that. Not alone. I had a lot of help from other members to fill out that lengthy IRS application. There was a lot of people that were involved in that process. I was the treasurer. My office address is our official address. But it was time, because my professional life has kind of made it where I'm not able to give as much time to the Clergy Project. So we just had our very first open nominations for board members in our first annual meeting. And so I volunteered to step down to make room, for some new people to come onto the board.
Well, thank you for being a part of that, because I can't think of, between the Clergy Project and Recovering from Religion, I can't think of, there's a lot of great resources now, but those are two of the best. As far as reaching people who are hurting, who need it, people who are in the pulpit who can't say nothing. That is some tough stuff. I thankfully never got to the point where I was preaching and having a congregation. I kind of I left the path earlier, but those are just great resources, and I'm grateful for everyone who's been involved in getting those going and helping people. It's really needed.
Well, and if I hate I'll ask forgiveness after I do this, but the Clergy Project could sure use people's support. They had a very sizable $100,000 grant that was provided by the Todd Steeple Foundation, but for a very specific purpose, and that was for job like career transitional services. So it's a company that we have contracted with at a special rate to provide help with resume writing and even job search for clergy who are needing help getting out and finding secular employment. But where we really hurt is with all of our other operating expenses and hardship grants and educational grants that we try to provide members. And so people can go to our website, clergyproject.org, and they can make a donation if they're interested in doing that. I wish one of the things that I was hoping that would happen is we could maybe talk, groups like the Southern Baptist Convention into supporting us, because we have a similar goal. We are trying to help clergy who no longer believe to get out of the pulpit. And they also very much don't want non-believing clergy in their pulpits.
That is an awesome point.
I think it would be a very difficult challenge to get them to come on board with the idea.
Yeah, because they're going to, if they know someone's doubting, they're going to want to take that person aside and coach them up and get them, in a better relationship with God. But maybe there's a way to say, hey, if someone's really, really not coming back, if they're either not going to be Southern Baptist anymore, or there's no going back for them, then why don't you work with us to help pass those people on to transition into something different?
Right. Well, and like with the Southern Baptist Church, Southern Baptists make up the majority of our members.
That doesn't surprise me, and that's sad. Just because it's such a fundamentalist faith, and that's why, because these people were living in a black and white world, and then they realized it was gray, and it's like, how do you come to terms with, everything's right and wrong, and all of a sudden it turns your world upside down? So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, there's about I haven't checked the current numbers, but I think it's over 700. We have about 700 members.
That's amazing. 700.
So these are all former and current clergy who no longer believe in God. We don't take anybody who is struggling with their faith. We will only accept you into our private forum if you have already given up your belief. Because we don't want anybody to think we're doing that. We're not about trying to deconvert people. We are about trying to help those who have already deconverted find a way to get out of the ministry.
That's smart. You don't want to have that perception. That's really smart. Well, Robert, how can people get in touch with you if they want to?
Well, if they want to, I do have a Facebook page, and there are several Robert Parham, Parham. There's several of those on Facebook, but mine, I'm in Tampa, Florida, and my email address, that's probably the best way to reach me, and that's r.parham, Parham, 68@gmail.com.
Well, and I apologize for not pronouncing your last name correctly.
No, that's
I realized
okay.
At the beginning, I think I said
almost no one does. So,
well, thank you so much for being on the podcast, and I really enjoyed hearing your story. I knew a little bit about it, and there were some pieces of it I was like, I think I remember him telling me that, but hearing the full thing was pretty cool, and you took time out of your day to do this, so I appreciate that.
Oh, no, it's my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Voices of Deconversion. Be sure to join us next week by subscribing to the podcast. If you'd like to learn more about upcoming episodes, sign up for our newsletter at vodpodcast.com.